The battlefield exhaled its final breath beneath a sky the color of dying embers. Smoke drifted across Valistia in slow, patient curls, and the wind carried the scent of iron, ash, and burnt cloth. Clive Rosfield stood among the ruins of what had once been an army, his sword half buried in the cracked earth, his shoulders rising and falling with the heavy rhythm of a man who had given more than his body should have allowed. Around him, the last embers of Eikonic fire flickered, hesitant, like candles unwilling to admit the night. He had won. He always won. And yet victory had stopped feeling like triumph long ago. It felt closer to survival, to the quiet relief of still being alive when so many others were not. He thought of names he could no longer say aloud, of faces he carried in the hollow space behind his ribs, and for a moment he allowed himself the dangerous luxury of stillness. That was when the sky tore open. It did not split with thunder, nor with the roar of an icon. It simply opened, the way a wound opens when pressure becomes too great. A line of crimson light cut across the heavens, widening into a rift that pulsed with something older than fire and colder than grief. From within it spilled an energy that did not belong to Valisthea. It tasted of sulfur on the tongue, of dried blood, of prayers spoken in tongues forgotten by men. Clive lifted his head. He did not run. Running was not in him. He raised his hand toward the rift, fingers tightening around the hilt of his blade, and the rift answered. It reached for him. There was no falling, only a long surrender of light. The world he knew thinned to a whisper, and then to silence, and then to nothing at all. When awareness returned, it returned as pain. Clive opened his eyes to a sky the color of arterial blood. Clouds moved across it in slow, unnatural spirals, as if something behind them were breathing. He lay in the dirt of a village that had once known laughter, and now knew only flies. Bodies lay in the streets, posed in the strange, broken postures of people who had died trying to reach one another. Symbols had been carved into doors and into flesh, jagged shapes that seemed to writhe when looked at directly. The air itself felt cursed. Each breath was thick, almost sweet, as though the world here had learned to ferment its sorrow. Clive rose slowly. His armor was scorched, his cloak torn, but his hand still remembered the shape of his sword. He moved through the village with the careful tread of a man who had walked through too many graveyards to mistake this one for ordinary. Then, behind him, he heard a sound that should not have been possible. The dead were moving. One by one, the bodies twitched, then rose, their limbs dragging at unnatural angles, their eyes filmed with a black that was not blindness but appetite. Clive turned, blade rising, and for a long moment he simply stared. He had fought monsters. He had fought gods. But this was something else. This was a world that refused to let its suffering end. And then, from beyond the broken wall, came the cry of a child. He moved without thinking. He crossed the village in long, certain strides, vaulting fallen beams and shattered carts, until he reached the edge of a square where a handful of survivors huddled together. Above them, descending from the bleeding sky on wings of leather and bone, came the horde. Demons, dozens of them, with mouths that opened sideways and claws that hissed against the air. They saw the survivors. They smiled. Clive stepped between them. He did not speak. He did not need to. The fire that had slept inside him through the long crossing woke now, all at once, and the ruined square filled with a light that had not touched this world in centuries. Phoenix flame curled around his arm, golden and alive, and the demons hesitated for the briefest of heartbeats, as though some ancient memory inside them recognized a heat that did not belong to hell. To the survivors crouched behind him, trembling, half-mad with fear, it looked as though an angel of flame had stepped into the apocalypse to stand watch over the end of the world. The fire did not leave him. Even after the demons had been scattered, even after the last of the rising dead had been returned to stillness, the warmth of the phoenix lingered in Clive Rosfield's hands, as if afraid to let him go in a place so cold. The survivors did not approach him at first. They watched him from the broken doorways and the shadows of collapsed homes, the way one might watch a storm that had decided, for reasons of its own, to spare the village. When he finally lowered his blade, an old man stepped forward. He did not bow. People here had forgotten how to bow to anything but grief. He simply offered Clive a cup of water, cloudy and warm, and said in a voice cracked by years of silence, "You are not from here." Clive drank. He did not answer. He had learned long ago that some questions are better met with patience than with words. In the days that followed, he began to move. He did not know where he was going. He only knew that he could hear the world calling, faintly, from every horizon. A column of smoke to the east. A scream carried on the wind from the north. A bell ringing without a bell ringer somewhere to the south. He followed each of them in turn. The settlements he found were small, hidden, half buried in the bones of older ruins. Their people lived behind walls of sharpened wood and prayer. They did not believe in saviors. They believed in lasting through the night, and then through the next, and then through the one after that. Hope in this place was a word that had been spoken so rarely that the children no longer knew what it meant. And yet Clive came. He came when the wolves of the deep woods turned out to be something far worse than wolves. He came when the wells began to whisper. He came when winged things circled above a chapel that had not held a service in a generation. Each time the fire answered him, and each time the demons learned again that there was a stranger in their world who did not know he was supposed to be afraid. Word began to travel. It traveled the way all true stories travel in dark times, in whispers passed from one cart driver to another, in the murmured prayers of mothers as they tucked their children into beds of straw. A wandering night, they said. A man wrapped in living flame. He asks for no payment. He stays no longer than he must. He looks at us as though we still matter. That last detail was the one they always returned to. They could believe in a warrior. They could even believe in the fire. But the look in his eyes, the quiet refusal to see them as ruins, that was the thing that unsettled them most. They had forgotten that anyone could look at them that way. Clive, for his part, noticed something disturbing as the days lengthened into weeks. It was not the demons. He had expected the demons. It was the people. They did not merely suffer. They expected to suffer. They built their homes with suffering in mind. They taught their children the songs of suffering before they taught them the names of stars. When he saved them, they thanked him, but beneath the thanks there was always the same quiet question, almost an apology. Why now? What will be taken in exchange? Hope, he realized, was almost forbidden here. To hope was to invite attention from things that fed on hope. To hope was to make oneself a target. He sat alone one night beside a low fire, watching the embers crawl, and thought of Valisthea, of a world that had also been broken but that had still, somehow, dared to dream. He looked at his hands. The phoenix slept inside them, patient, ancient. If hope was forbidden here, then he would have to bring it himself. He found them in a place that had once been a library. The roof was gone, the shelves were ash, but a circle of figures still gathered there at dusk, hooded against the wind. Bent over fragments of parchment and broken tablets as though the words on them might still save someone. They called themselves the Horodrem, or what remained of them, and they had been watching the horizon long before Clive arrived. They did not draw weapons when he stepped into their circle. They had been expecting him. That, more than anything else, made Clive uneasy. Their leader was a woman whose hair had gone white before its time, and whose eyes carried the steady, exhausted patience of someone who had read too many prophecies and survived too few. She gestured for him to sit. She offered him bread that tasted of dust and wine that tasted of memory, and then she began to speak. For generations, she told him, the balance of sanctuary had been a fragile thing. Heaven and hell had each pressed their weight upon the world, and mortal kind had lived in the narrow space between, paying for every breath with blood. The scholars of her order had learned to read the signs. They knew when the dark was about to deepen. They knew when the light was about to flicker. And in recent weeks, every sign they trusted had begun to scream. Demons were gathering, she said, in numbers not seen in living memory. Cults that had been dormant for centuries had stirred awake in a single night. The lesser evils whispered to one another across the deep places of the world, and the whisper they passed was a single word, repeated in 100 tongues. Clive said nothing. He let her continue. It was not the fire of hell that troubled them, she said. Hell's fire they understood. They had charts for it, rituals against it, scars that remembered it. What troubled them was a different flame, a flame that had entered sanctuary from somewhere outside the known wheel of creation. A flame that did not answer to the burning hells, nor to the high heavens, nor to any of the powers their order had catalogued across 1,000 years. She looked at him then, and her eyes did not flinch. "That flame," she said, "is sitting at my table." A younger scholar, a demon hunter with crossbows still strapped to his back, leaned forward. He spoke more bluntly. The arrival of Clive had disturbed something. The infernal pressure on the world was rising faster now, as though hell had felt a new heat and turned, slowly, to look. The cults were not gathering at random. They were gathering toward him. He was the lodestone now. He was the question hell wished to answer. Clive listened in silence. He thought of the phoenix sleeping inside his chest. He thought of all the times in Valisthea when his power had been called a gift, and all the times it had been called a curse, and how rarely the two had been told apart. He thought of the villagers who had begun to whisper his name with something dangerously close to faith. "Then I should leave," he said at last. "If my presence draws them, I should go where there are no people." The woman shook her head slowly. "You misunderstand. There is nowhere in sanctuary without people. And even if there were, hell has already noticed you. Leaving will not unwrite that. Hiding will not unwrite that." She reached across the broken table and placed a thin, dark stone in front of him. It pulsed faintly, like a heart that had forgotten its rhythm. "What you carry," she said, "is older than this world's quarrel. The lords below do not yet know what to do with it. They will try to take it. They will try to twist it. They will try, if all else fails, to make you wish you had never carried it at all. So you must decide, while the choice is still yours, what kind of fire you intend to be." He found the first of the corrupted villages by following the smoke. It rose in a column too straight to be natural, too dark to be wood. When he crested the ridge above it, he understood why. The smoke was not gray. It was black, a deep, oily black that drank the light around it and gave nothing back. And at its base, where the village should have been, there was only a wide circle of scorched earth and a ring of figures kneeling around something that pulsed. Clive came down through the trees in silence. He had learned in his weeks here that the best way to enter a nightmare was slowly. The cultists did not see him at first. They were chanting, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm older than language, and at the center of their circle a brazier burned with a fire he recognized and did not recognize. The flame was iconic. The shape of it, the way it curled, the way it breathed, was unmistakable. It was the phoenix, but the color was wrong. Where his fire was gold, this fire was the deep, sick black of a wound left too long untended, edged with a violet that hurt to look at. He understood then. They were not summoning their own power. They were copying his. They had been studying the flame that had entered their world, and they had begun, in their patient and terrible way, to learn its shape and defeat it. Around the brazier, laid in careful rows, were the bodies of villagers. Men, women. Their faces had been arranged into expressions of peace, as though the cult had wished, in some final cruelty, to suggest that they had gone willingly. Clive's hand tightened on his sword until the leather of his glove creaked. What followed was not a battle. It was a reckoning. He came through the circle like a storm that had finally remembered what it was for. And the cultists died as cultists die, which is to say, surprised, even though they had spent their whole lives preparing for it. He did not enjoy it. He had stopped enjoying such things long ago, but he did not slow. When the last of them lay still, he stood before the brazier. The corrupted flame reached for him. It recognized him. It wanted to be claimed. He extinguished it with a single closing of his hand and felt, for a moment, something inside him recoil at how easy it had been. In the days that followed, he found more. A monastery whose monks had been turned inside out by their own prayers. A river whose water ran warm and red and whose fish had grown small, useless wings. A creature in a cave that had once been a bear and was now something that wore a bear's memory like a coat. Each of them carried, somewhere on it, the faint signature of his fire. Twisted, but unmistakable. Hell was not merely interested in him. Hell was studying him. Hell was, in the patient, hungry way of all old things, trying to learn how to wear him. He camped one night in the ruins of a chapel, beneath a vault of stone that had cracked but not yet fallen, and for the first time since his arrival, he could not sleep. He sat with his back against the cold wall and looked at his hands in the firelight. And a thought came to him that he had never quite allowed himself to think before. The phoenix had always frightened him a little, even at home, even among friends. He had carried it as a duty, and a duty is a useful word, because it lets a man avoid the harder one, which is danger. His fire had always been a danger. To his enemies, yes, but also in some quiet corner of his mind that he visited only late at night, to himself. And now, in this world, he had seen what his fire could become if it was bent. He had seen the color it could turn. He had seen the shape it could take. He had seen the rows of small bodies arranged around it in their false peace. For the first time since he had stepped through the rift, Clive Rosfield was afraid. Not of demons, not of the lords below, not of the dying world. He was afraid of himself. He was afraid of the man he might become if he stayed here too long, fought too hard, lost too much. He was afraid of the moment when the fire inside him might look up, see what the world around it was, and decide that it belonged. The Horridrim brought him the map at dawn. They unrolled it across the broken stones of their meeting place, and Clive saw, marked in red ink that had not quite dried, the place where everything would be decided. A fortress in the south, half sunk into the earth, built by hands that had not been human even when they were alive. The cult had taken it. The cult had been preparing it. And inside its broken walls they were building a ritual that would not merely corrupt his fire. He would open a gate. He did not ask how many of them there were. The number did not matter. He asked only when the ritual would begin. Tonight, the white-haired woman said, at the hour when the sky bleeds thickest. He left before the sun was fully up. He did not travel alone. A handful of demon hunters followed him at a distance, and a few of the villagers he had saved came too, carrying weapons they barely knew how to hold, their faces set in the particular expression of people who have decided that dying for something is better than dying for nothing. He did not turn them away. He had learned, here, that to refuse a person their courage was a cruelty almost equal to despair. The fortress rose before them in the late afternoon, black against a sky the color of an old bruise. Around it the land had gone wrong. The grass had died in spirals. The trees had bent inward as though listening. The air carried the same sweet, fermented smell he had tasted on his first day in this world, only thicker now, almost a syrup. Hell was waiting. The first wave came before they reached the gate. Hellspawn poured out of the broken ground itself, clawing up through the dirt as though the earth had grown tired of holding them. Clive met them with fire. The demon hunters loosed their bolts. The villagers screamed and swung and lived longer than they had any right to. And behind it all, deep within the fortress, a low chanting began to rise. The chant was in his fire's voice. That was the thing that pushed him forward when his body would have stopped. The sound of his own flame, stolen and turned, calling out from inside walls he had not yet broken. He moved through the courtyard like a man who had decided that exhaustion was simply another opinion. He cut down a thing that had once been a night. He cut down a thing that had never been anything but hunger. He climbed stairs slick with substances he refused to name. At the heart of the fortress, in a chamber whose ceiling had been carved into a great open mouth, the ritual was almost complete. A gate hung in the air above the altar, half open, edges trembling. Through it he could see shapes moving. Tall shapes, patient shapes. The high priest of the cult turned to face him. He was smiling. He had been waiting his whole life for this smile. "You came," the priest said. "We knew you would. The fire wants to come home." Clive did not answer. He raised his sword. What followed was not a duel. The priest was nothing, a small man wearing a large robe, and he fell quickly. The battle was with the gate itself, and with the corrupted flame that surged from the altar to meet him, recognizing its source and reaching for it with a hunger that was almost a kind of love. The two fires met in the center of the chamber. For a long, terrible moment, Clive felt the corruption pressing against him from the inside. He felt the version of himself that the cult had been building, the version with the black flame and the violet edges and the small, peaceful bodies arranged in rows. He felt how easy it would be to let go, how tired he was, how much simpler it would be to belong to this world, to stop fighting its weight, to let the phoenix become whatever the lords below wished it to be. And then he thought of the old man who had handed him a cup of cloudy water on his first day, the child whose cry had pulled him across a broken square, the villagers behind him now, in the courtyard, swinging weapons they barely knew how to hold. He thought very clearly no. The phoenix answered. It rose in him not as a weapon, but as a refusal. Gold light burst from his chest, his arms, his open mouth, and it did not strike the corrupted flame. It burned through it. It burned the corruption out of it. It burned the gate. It burned the altar. It burned the chamber. It burned the part of the fortress where the chanting had begun, and the part of the world where the chanting had been heard. Hell, for the first time in a very long time, took a single, careful step backward. He walked out of the fortress at dawn. His armor was half melted. His cloak was gone. His sword was notched in places that no smith would be able to repair. Behind him, the black walls were collapsing inward, slowly, almost gently, like a thing finally allowed to rest. The sky above had not changed. It was still the color of a wound. But for the first time since his arrival, the wound looked like it might, one day, scar over. The survivors waited for him in the courtyard, fewer than had begun the night, more than he had dared to hope. No one cheered. They had not relearned cheering yet. But the old man from the first village was there, somehow, leaning on a stick, and when Clive passed him, the old man placed a hand briefly on his arm, and that was enough. It was enough for both of them. In the weeks that followed, Sanctuary did something it had not done in a very long time. It exhaled. The pressure of imminent ruin lifted, only slightly, only in certain places, but enough that people began to notice the difference. A baker in a town to the north reopened his oven. A child somewhere east laughed at a joke whose punchline involved a goat. A bell rang at the proper hour, rung by an actual bell ringer for an actual service. These were small things. Clive understood that. He had lived long enough to know that small things were usually all there was. The demons did not vanish. Of course they did not. The war that had defined this world for centuries did not end because one fortress had fallen. There were still cults. There were still gates. There were still lords below, patient, watching, recalculating. The hordes told him as much, plainly, without softening it. They were not in the business of softening, but something had shifted. The villagers fought back now in places where they had only fled before. The demon hunters moved with a steadiness they had not carried in years. The whispered name of the wandering knight had grown into something else, something more dangerous to the dark. It had become an example. If he could stand, perhaps they could stand. If he could refuse, perhaps they could refuse. Hope in Sanctuary was still a fragile thing. It still drew the attention of things that fed on it. But Clive had come to understand in his time here that the fragility was the point. Hope mattered most precisely because it could be broken. A thing that could not be broken did not need defending. A thing that could was the only thing worth standing in front of. He sat one evening on a low hill above a village that had begun, cautiously, to rebuild. He watched the lamps come on in the windows, one by one, hesitant, like animals testing the air. He thought of Valisthea. He thought of the rift in the sky that had brought him here. And he wondered, as he had wondered many times, whether it would open again, and whether he would step through it if it did. He decided that night that he would not. Not yet. Not while the lamps were still hesitant. Not while the bell ringers were still relearning their hours. Not while the lords below were still recalculating, still watching, still patient. He would go home one day. He believed that. He needed to believe that. But home would still be there when this place no longer needed him. And this place, for now, still needed him. He rose from the hill as the last of the lamps came on. He sheathed his battered sword. The phoenix stirred inside him, quiet, content, awake. Somewhere to the south he could feel a new pressure beginning, the slow gathering of another storm. He turned toward it without hurry. A man who has decided to stay does not need to hurry. He needs only to walk. The stories began the way all true stories begin, without anyone deciding to start them. A trader passing through a mountain village would mention almost in passing that he had seen a knight on the road. A child in a market would describe, with the unembarrassed certainty of children, the man who had once stood between her family and a thing with too many mouths. A scholar of the Horridrim would record, in careful ink, the places where corruption had been burned cleanly out of the world. The stories did not always agree. In some he was tall as a tower. In others he was a quiet man who drank cloudy water without complaint. In some his fire was gold. In others it was the color of the first sunrise anyone in the village could remember. In some he was an angel. In others he was simply a stranger who had decided, for reasons no one fully understood, that this world was worth defending. Some called him a blessing. Others called him impossible. A few, in the deepest places of sanctuary, in the chambers below the chambers, in the rooms where the lords below still gathered to speak in low voices about what had gone wrong at the fortress in the south, called him by a different name entirely. They did not say it often. They did not like the taste of it, but they said it. They called him the flame that refused. Wherever demons gathered now, the rumor moved faster than they did. A column of cultists marching through a forest would find the forest already lit. A creature stirring in a cave would find the cave already empty, its prey already gone, a single set of footprints in the ash by the entrance. The lords below sent emissaries. The emissaries did not return. The lords below sent stronger emissaries. Those did not return either. And deep within sanctuary's darkness, in the small rooms where small people had once been told that hope was forbidden, something began, very slowly, to change. Mothers began to teach their children the names of stars again, before they taught them the songs of suffering. Bell ringers rang their bells at the proper hours. Bakers opened their ovens. A boy in a coastal town who had never in his life seen the sea without smoke on it, watched a clean horizon for the first time and did not know what to call the feeling in his chest. The feeling did not yet have a name in this world. It had been gone too long, but it was returning, carried in whispers, carried in lamplight, carried in the footsteps of a wandering knight who had decided, against every reason the world had given him, to stay. Wherever demons gathered, fire followed. And deep within sanctuary's long, patient darkness, against every prophecy, against every warning, against every lord below who had ever sworn it could not happen, hope began, very quietly, to burn again.